All right. I think I'm streaming to nobody at the moment, but that's what it is. That's what it is. Okay. Let's see. All right. We're going to do a little bit of a review. If people show, they show. If they don't, they don't. You can't say I didn't try. No, you can't. All right. So, tomorrow's exam, quiz, whatever. It's going to have a bunch of different things on it. Figured you guys wanted to know what they might be. So let's start with the list, all right? So for me, the topics we need to cover tomorrow are going to be basically categorized into three broad groups. You could figure something like 20, 30 questions tomorrow. Pretty much all Regents exam questions. I want to kind of get a variety of them and so on. So some may have been the same ones that appeared on the benchmark. I'm perfectly okay with that. So the big kind of broad categories are going to be the Between the Wars, and then we're going to have World War II, some, I note some, okay, and then we're going to have Imperial Japan. Now, that's going to be a big kind of, what's the word for this? This is a very broad, sweeping set of categories, so let's break it down a little bit. In the Between the Wars section, I'm also including the idea of the Russian Revolution is in here. Basically, everything the packets that you were given were on is stuff that's going to be in this. So keep that in mind. So all those various packets that we had, they're all valid stuff, okay? So feel free to go back through the Google Classroom. I don't want to put it on stream because your names are up here and that's not kosher. But if you go back through the assignments, you'll see a couple of these. There's a Japanese Imperial one, the Causes of World War II homework packet. I gave you guys the Russian Revolution one. Yes, so just those three alone, I think, are the extent of the packets. So please make sure that you give that material a look again. It's only in your interest to do so, so please do so. In addition, we're going to look at the Treaty of Versailles and the rise of fascism. Now, I'm not as concerned about the specific history of the fascist leaders and the fascist nations that arose. I'm concerned about what is fascism as a model of government. How does fascist things come into power? And let's compare them, be able to compare them to the Soviet state, okay? So let's be able to do that. So in other words, let's be able to do a comparative between totalitarian states. That's very important. And this era, those totalitarian states largely are going to take two forms. They're going to take the forms of, firstly, the fascist states, which from our sort of case studies are basically Italy, Germany, and Japan later on. And then we've got, of course, the communist states, of which we really have one. And that's going to be the USSR, Soviet Union. Be careful not to call it Russia anymore. It wasn't just Russia. So under the power of the Soviet Union, the Russian government dominated a number of other countries. And as a result, they created this empire called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. And that is where that comes from. So keep that in mind as you're going through your work. So why don't we start with that just very briefly, okay? So what are some of the comparatives? Well, remember, they are both, right? Let me do it this way. How about do they have similarities? I guess I'll do it all in capitals. And where do they have differences, right? So in terms of similarities, do remember you're dealing with totalitarian states, right? So these are totalitarian, meaning they're both going to come into your life and dictate, whether in practice or just having the power and reserve to do so, the ability to come into your life and just bang, do whatever they want to your life, okay? That's totally their discretion. They can do that. That's up to them. All right, so it's absolutely a huge factor. You do want to make sure that you don't have that part in the you don't forget that element is there, that they're both in the end going to be fascist states. In addition, both of them are going to select a sort of like an enemy group, okay? Both rely on an enemy, I'm going to call it a targeted enemy group. And this group is going to be internal. See, in other words, it's not good enough to have a state that has a totalitarian ruler and then have that totalitarian ruler point out to, say, the outside world, other nations, and go, that's your enemy. You need the enemy within. And the reason you need the enemy within to get totalitarian style power is you need to convince your population that the measures you're taking are absolutely necessary because the threat that you're facing as a population is so large that even though, yes, we have moved in this totalitarian direction, even though, yes, we've taken away some of those core powers that you may have once enjoyed, nevertheless, this is necessary because the situation is so serious, is so dire, there can be no other solution. This is what we have to do. So that need for an internal enemy is going to be part of both systems. Now, the enemy itself is going to be one of the differences. So, although they both have internal enemies, the internal enemy is different. So for the fascists, it's almost always going to be based around a race or what would be the word? A race, or I don't want to say immigrant because that's not quite the right answer. It's a racial target. Okay. Now there are other groups you could use, and it comes down to the idea of there is a purity of the national body, national race, right? So remember, fascists talk in terms of organics. So they'll call the targets they don't want viruses, disease, pests, rodents. They'll use this kind of language of disease and pestilence when talking about this race or whatever group this is that they want to target. And they always talk about them in how their presence, their very presence, is a threat to the purity of the national body, the national race. Because remember, the idea, of course, in fascism is you are not important. The state is important. Your job as an individual is to serve the mission of the national state, the national mission. And therefore, a good Italian is Italian that puts the nation before all else, more than their children, more than their family, and so on and so forth. And as we know, in a place like, the Western free country like America, we don't have those kind of attitudes here, right? We do think of individual first, family second, friend group third, and the nation really kind of last. And that's why we as a culture group, we tend to honor people who enter military service, because the thought process is that's really someone who has sacrificed those first three sort of rings, right? Care for self, care for family, care for friends, care for community, and gone straight to the community thing, and and said I'll pass up on those other elements and risk them in order to serve the community first, which is where the selflessness of that action comes from. But that's very much a Western value. That's not a value the East has at all. Well, I don't want to say the East, but that's not a value that fascist and communist states have at all. So that's the first big issue, is this. The fascists see it as a racial issue. That's your target. That's your enemy. And so you have your examples, right? So you have the Jews as a chosen racial target, but you also have anybody that's in a group that's considered to be a danger to the purity of the blood of the nation. So I point that out because sometimes it's not a racial group. Like, for example, in Nazi Germany, anyone with disabilities, developmental, mental, physical, doesn't matter. If it was known or obvious you had a disability, you would probably be wiped out, even if you were a German, because part of the problem from the perspective of the Nazi Party was these people, if they're allowed to exist, make this state, the nation, weaker. Again, this comes back to this, and the fascists have this. I'll put this here. The fascists have that social Darwinism dynamic, right? That the race is on the national race is on an evolutionary trajectory, and if we allow these disease, weak, whatever, what's the word I want to use? Whatever sort of insults they want to put upon these groups that they're targeting, if they allow them to survive, it slows and may even distort that upward trajectory that the race is on, and therefore we have to protect the purity of the race by wiping everybody else out. And of course, again, they will invent these narratives, They will invent these ideas like, okay, Jews do this and gypsies do that. And this is always, with the idea being that, hey, when you're not looking, they're secretly destroying your society you got to wipe them out. We got to get rid of them. If we get rid of them, you'll be better. Your neighborhood will be better. Don't you want a Germany good for Germans? Again, that was sort of the attitude and the logic. Now, when it comes to the communists, their enemy is different. It's still internal. And the internal enemy for the communists are going to be the rich. Specifically, when Karl Marx came up with this, it was the idea of the property owner class, what he called the capitalist or the bourgeoisie, those who own the capital, those who own the property. So the rich are property owning class. So if you were a businessman, a factory owner, or even a professional, if you own things, specifically land and resources, you were considered to be the enemy, right? That your workers were being exploited by you, that you're not paying them a proper share of their earnings because, after all, they're the ones who are doing the actual work, and you're just kind of sitting there collecting your check, or at least this is the implication. And as a result, you're actually just using the structure of business as a way to keep these people down and to keep them destitute and keep them weak and keep them servile. But in reality, what the communists, of course, suggest is that there needs to be a class war. So whereas the fascists see everything in terms of race and racial wars, the communists see it as a class war. So it's not so much that there is a Russia for Russians. That was not the case in communism. It was much more about, we should find the rich and kill them, take their stuff, and distribute it to everybody, because that's the moral thing to do, is to make sure everybody gets to share in this wealth. So that was sort of the argument that was being made. And that's how both communists and fascists are actually quite similar in their aims and even their methodologies. They just simply kind of have, it's almost like, remember when you were a kid, you had those Mad Libs, where you'd have a sentence with a blank, and you could fill it in with all kinds of words and still made up sense as a sentence. That's kind of the situation here. So you can have like a Mad Lib of communism versus fascism, and just insert in their various views on things, and most sentences would work. Fascists are evil because blank, blank, and blank. Communists are evil because blank, 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 and blank. And you could put in just whatever words or terms or phrases make sense for that particular philosophy, and you will still have a sentence that's accurate, because, again, their methodologies were quite similar. It is the use of, or it is the motivation for the philosophies that do differ. But in the end, they both want extreme controls, total controls. In the end, they both manipulate newspapers. In the end, they both control government media. In the end, they both have fake trials or trumped up charges that are made out of nothing, or whatever it might be. So these are all things that they do continuously in both fascist and communist societies. And the only real difference then, and by the way, they're both more than happy to spread their message via war, or whatever that might be. From a fascist perspective, of course, we have to do war. This is how the state stays strong. And then on top of that, it's how we ensure our enemies are destroyed, further proving our racial superiority. For the sake of the communists, yeah, war is absolutely a good idea, because, after all, the noblest thing we can do as communists is spread the mission of communism around the world, right? So this was the belief system that these two groups had. So that's going to be a big part of that before the war stuff. So please make sure you know those things. I'm not going to ask like the details of Hitler's life growing up, although, something like a difference between Mussolini and Hitler would be Hitler actually had a military background. That might be something that could come up, I guess, supposedly, theoretically on a Regents exam. But it's not certainly the only thing. All right, let me kind of wrap these. So Imperial Japan, we've been talking about, and you have a bracket on it, and we've been doing it recently, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. The World War II elements I'm most concerned about is not like the structure of the war, just kind of know those core elements, like who are the allies, who are the Axis, know, for example, why did World War II happen, and really lay into how the Treaty of Versailles really set it up to basically be inevitable. A big idea question is, to what extent is World War II really just World War I, but Part 2? In other words, is it actually a different conflict altogether that we should call it World War II? or is it actually just a continuation after a 20-year ceasefire of the conflict that began back in World War One? Now, the motivations are certainly different. There's no Hitler-like figure running Germany in World War One. There just simply isn't. And there's no, the Italians are totally different. The Japanese are really totally different. But nevertheless, does the conditions, the unresolved problems of World War One, are those really the chief cause to the beginning of World War Two? In other words, had Germany been in a place of national unity, a sense of pride, had never gone through the hyperinflation. Another thing you should know about the hyperinflation of the German money during the period between World War One and World War Two. If they had not been in a position where they were meant to both feel and be the scapegoat of World War One, would they have accepted a guy like Hitler into their country, into their leadership? It's hard to know. And again, dispel the myth that Hitler came to power legally. Not really. Some of his party won seats semi-legally. Remember, they were beating people in the streets and engaging in political violence to ensure certain segments of the public were voting and certain segments of the public were not. And remember that the way Hitler became chancellor was to actually cut a deal with the existing government, a deal that was not legal, but rather was like an under-the-table kind of situation. So let's not get too lost in the myth that Hitler was elected. Likewise, Mussolini also basically did seize power. So these guys do not come to power. None of these systems of communism or fascism come to power in ways that are sort of peaceful transitions on democratic principles. No one actually does poll a population and go, would you like fascism? Would you like communism, and get a positive result? That doesn't happen. And it didn't happen in these cases. It feels sometimes like, okay, Germans were complicit, and to a certain degree they were. Naturally, once these guys are in power, it becomes a very, very, very large individual risk to go, yeah, I don't think I want them anymore after all. Well, that ship has sailed. So it's not like there are really true and honest democratic debates about these things in these countries. That's not the case. The other part about World War II is kind of understand the role of Russia. I shouldn't do that, sorry. The USSR's role as a former, I'm not going to call it German ally. I think that's a little strong. But a German, as a former neutral party in regards to Germany, and how their switch to the Allies, thanks to the German invasion, changed the war. This was a big blunder by Hitler. Most historians say that Hitler's real troubles began when he simply decided to attack Russia, the Soviet Union. Others will say, well, that fight was inevitable. Stalin was never going to let Germany just kind of sit there on its borders like that, despite whatever agreements they may have had previously. But certainly the breakup of that Soviet-Nazi non-aggression pact absolutely set the stage for Nazi defeat by Nazis attacking the Soviet Union and finding the resistance there to be much, much, much stiffer than they had maybe anticipated. This created a massive problem for them. That was the kind of problem that really the Nazi army does not really fully recover from. It gives the ability of the Allies in North Africa to defeat the German legions in North Africa and the Italians who had been there, and it gives them the ability to actually take Italy altogether and eventually do the D-Day invasion and so on. So Hitler's preoccupation with the Soviet invasion really does just devastates his war effort. So these kind of blunders are what history is sometimes made on, particularly when they're made by very big, important people. But that is kind of where we're at. Okay, I got 2 people here watching. I've been doing this for 24 minutes or so, probably 20 after my little break there. I'm not going to go through much to Imperial Japan. If either one of you have a question, put it in chat, and I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of let it go for 5 minutes or ish, maybe a little less if no one responds. And then we will see. If you guys have some questions, I'll go over them. If not, then we'll probably just call it here because I do have something to do at 9:15, and I could use a coffee right now to keep going. So tea's not cutting it. All right. Well, if I don't hear or see any chat go up, I know that my delay is long since expired, so you heard me. Then I'm just going to call it here. All right. No one's knocking at my door. So, all right, gang. To the extent to which it helped, that's great. If you want to tell other people, this will be up on the website, on YouTube, on this channel in about probably 10 minutes. I have to basically stop the stream, just check off that I didn't use any AI children in it for whatever reason. And then it'll be good to go, and it'll be there as a VOD, and you guys could just watch it later or tomorrow morning if it helps at all. But this is basically what we're looking at, about 10 multiple choice questions on each topic. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.